Welcome back to False Market Value, The Two Towers, Extended Edition. I'm your host, Ross Kennerly. With me today is DJ Cruiser, our guest and producer for this episode. If you enjoyed Volume 1, you're really going to love this one. Check out False Market Value on YouTube for bonus content from this episode, and let's pick things back up at Logo Soup. Let's talk on the real brands. Now, I had my own list. After doing some research, watching the film, I think I have a better one. So there's an infographic that's part of an article on a site called Hollywood Branded. And so they break down Wayne's World product placements in 1992. Because, as we talked about, that one scene where they sort of gleefully, at least in the context of the movie, sell out by pitching all of these brands and giving them recognition. There's someone that actually broke all this down for marketers, right? This is how product placements showed up in Wayne's World. And this is the point where that scene that we've talked about, that sellout scene, became a lightning rod, if you will, for the marketing community to say, okay, this worked for this film, but only because of who Mike Myers and Dana Carvey are playing those characters in this sort of tongue-in-cheek movie to begin with. It makes sense for that film, but the point that they're making is that brands are really obtrusive if it's not done in an organic fashion. And there were some organic brands, like you had mentioned at the top, that on the music related side that you were surprised were in there. So I'm going to go through the product placements, and then I'd like you to kind of break down where you saw, real brands in there that I think we can get into missed opportunities from the sponsorship side as we get farther in here. But I'd like to at least know from your perspective if they caught everything, and if there's anything else that you saw that you think we should come back to when we get into that missed opportunities section. So I want to break down this list of real brands, and this is according to Hollywood Branded, that broke down every brand that shows up in the movie. So let's compare what they've compiled to, what we put together. So Fender, Reebok, Corvette, Mountain Dew, Pepsi, GMC, Duracell, Coca-Cola, Wilson, Payless, Washburn Guitars, which you just mentioned, Chia Pet, White Castle, Levi's, Jack Daniels, Yamaha, Grey Poupon. There's a Grey Poupon joke in there, even though Grey Poupon doesn't show up on the set. Most people wouldn't remember those ads. Unless they grew up. I'm sure you can look them up on YouTube. But the Grey Poupon thing was like a pop culture running gag that everybody in your family made a Grey Poupon joke at one point in the 90s. So anyway, Evian, Guess, Ralph Lauren, AMC, Converse, Sherwood, Crate Amplification, Nuprin, Nike, Doritos, Lincoln, and Zildjian, the symbol covers. So that's a pretty extensive list. The ones that I picked up on that weren't on that list, I think they mentioned Corvette, AC Delco, which is a GM brand, gets recognition in Phil's Garage for a minute. They reference Bubblicious in a joke that they make. They talk about Star Trek. Garth is whistling the original Star Trek. Noah Vanderhoff talks about the first time he interacted with Pong, which is a real brand. And then the rest of them are all relatively represented. Those are the only ones I didn't notice, but I didn't know if from your perspective you saw there was anything on the music brand side, like Washburn Guitars or Zildjian. If there's anything out there that stood out to you that isn't on that list, because it's a pretty extensive list, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, I was listening to you rattle that off, all those brands, and I don't remember if you mentioned DW drums, DW percussion.
No, not on there.
Nope, that's in there. I believe that is in the scene with Alice Cooper on stage. I believe the drummer is playing DW drums.
Got it.
And also Marshall amplification. Is that in there?
No.
Because that occurs in the movie as well. I believe Crucial Taunt and Alice Cooper's bands have Marshall amplification. Beyond that, what stood out to me, and I don't know if you want to go into missed opportunities from here or not, but I noticed the besides the Nuprin, Pizza Hut, Doritos, Reebok, Pepsi, and subsequently Mountain Dew, obviously for the sellout scene, but Yamaha, when Dana Carvey's playing the drum solo, Yamaha's the drum rack, Zildjian cymbals, Washburn guitars, Fender amps, Crate amplification, noticed all those.
Well, what stood out to me was Cassandra's Fender bass.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very obvious that that's a Fender bass. And if Cassandra was the lead singer and performer for a band called Crucial Tone in 1992, she would absolutely play a Fender bass. I just totally, just the design and the sleekness of it, given what she wears when she performs on stage, makes perfect sense to have her do that.
It fits the persona, it fits the style of the music,
totally.
It fits everything. It
fits. It doesn't necessarily fit metal per se, but it definitely fits what she's projecting on stage. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly.
She would choose. All right, so this is a good segue. As part of Logo Soup, one of the notes I had that I wanted to talk to you about and get your opinion on is corporate involvement in music in general, right? So there's a whole bunch of brands there. We'll come back to the Pepsi, Taste of the Next Generation scene that they do in the film. That's the most famous moment from this film. I promise we'll get to that. But the thing I wanted to talk to you about as part of this is, and you had mentioned there might be some brands when we get to missed opportunities that might fit, what they're trying to do a little bit more relevant to the experience. And one of the things we talked about on the podcast in previous discussions covering previous fictional sponsorship is just making sure that, one, you know who your audience is, first of all, and then two, that whatever integration you have into whatever the property is. And when we say property, if you're going to pursue selling sponsorship and integrate brands into your experience, we talked about how influencers are really good at this and how they have really good engagement with their audiences on behalf of brands, which then creates real authentic connections for that brand because of the relevance of the content. And frankly, for podcasts, it's the same thing. If it relates to the subject matter of what it is that's being produced, then corporate support can actually help amplify that and add to the experience if it's done in the right way, right? It has to be done tastefully. It has to be relevant and organic. It has to be authentic to the experience.
Essentially what they used to call complimentary copy in print back in the day. That's what that is.
Yeah. So as it relates to just music in general, both in 92 and now, and I'll share a quick anecdote too, because I wanted to touch on this. So just corporate sponsorship or corporate engagement in music, the experience I have. So we mentioned when we were gigging around Chicago, one of the things that my band played in was a battle of the bands, right? When we weren't necessarily receptive to the idea of a battle of the bands, but one of my wife's friends, who was like our biggest fan, which if she's listening, appreciate you for coming to every single show and legitimately liked our music. And I'd ask her, I see you at every single show. And she's like, yes, I legitimately love your band. I'm like, that's awesome. Like, please come to every single show. But she was dating somebody that hosted this battle of the bands at the Elbow Room, which no longer exists in Chicago. It was off of Lincoln Avenue. And the Elbow Room was a real popular sort of independent music venue that they would bring local bands and play there. That's what it was. And they, in large part, those would be, cover bands most nights. But they had two different stages, one upstairs and then one downstairs in the basement. Shout out to Basements as part of this podcast and their importance to the music industry. And so the Elbow Room hosted this Battle of the Bands, and it was sponsored by Sailor Jerry's Rum. So we played in the show, and we didn't have to do any like live reads or sponsor plugs or anything while we were performing. That was sort of, the performers were immune from having any sort of corporate engagement, but the person that was emceeing the event did, plug them at the top, and we've got a Sailor Jerry promotion going on, and the folks, the local brand representatives are here, that sort of thing, and they just served Sailor Jerry Rum as a featured liquor while we're all upstairs performing. And frankly, it didn't bother me. I mean, the way that, meaning like as a performer, I was happy to see Sailor Jerry there simply because the whole idea of Sailor Jerry tattoos, and they had, literature at this event where they're talking about sort of where they started as a brand and, what their aesthetic is and what their values are and that sort of thing, related to what the Elbow Room was doing and this particular event was doing around the Battle of the Bands. It made sense to have a company like that there, just with the history of tattoos and all those things, and sort of like tied into the hipster culture, which was the genesis of a lot of the bands or the type of music that the fans listened to. Sailor Jerry's trying to tap into their affinity for the music that was being played and establishing himself as a supporter of independent music or the independent music scene in Chicago. So it made sense to have them there, and it was fine. It was a good part of the experience. But what Noah's Arcade does, or what Benjamin tries to do for Noah's Arcade, relates to Wayne's World is completely incongruent. And I want to get into some of the things that don't make a lot of sense because, as I mentioned to you, I said a lot of it's like overcooked, even if you're going to incorporate a relevant sponsor into some sort of content, like in this case, a podcast, or if we're going to incorporate it into like a television show, there's a way to do it that is even above and beyond what would be considered tasteful, even if it made sense for the content. And they definitely blow way past that line with what they're doing for Noah's Arcade, which is obviously the point. But
and there's some context to that though that I want to hit on is when you're done.
Go ahead. I'm just curious, like just your opinion as a music producer. I mean, have you had any sort of label or other corporate engagement with any of the acts that you've represented? And I think you mentioned you sponsored a music festival at one point, right?
I sponsored a couple of things, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
I do not have any direct experience with a recording client.
Okay.
And a sponsor of a recording client of mine. So I've not had the pleasure of a rando in my studio trying to push my buttons while I'm trying to engineer a recording. I've not had the pleasure of doing that, thankfully.
So is that an association? The first thing that pops to mind with regard to a sponsor representative is coming in and pushing your buttons.
Yes. Yeah. Don't anybody touch my soundboard. I mean, you come into my studio, you do not touch that PFL button. I swear to God, I will chop your hand off.
Okay.
Anyway, but I've never had to deal with another producer butting heads with me or any of my anybody. So thankfully there. Okay. I was a sponsor of two major events in the Cleveland area back in the day.
KSD Studios.
KSD Studios, I should say.
Yeah, as a brand was sponsoring. Okay.
Was the sponsor of two events in 2013. Well, actually, one of them was technically 2012 and 2013. We were a unpaid, so to speak, sponsor of the Rock City Festival in Lorain County, Ohio, which brought together bands from all over like Northern Ohio into one setting and put on like a day-long music festival from like very early in the day to way late at night. And as a sponsor, so to speak, we were given a tent like very close to the main stage, and we had our exposure and blah, blah, blah. The second year we did that though.
When you say you're an unpaid sponsor, just a quick clarifying question for the audience. So when you say unpaid, what were they asking you for? Right. So if you're a sponsor there, what were you providing that this festival needed?
We were providing an outlet for the musicians who were on their stage. Essentially, that was kind of why we were there, more or less.
Okay. Makes sense to have a music producer have a presence there. Can you help out some of these independent acts that are there?
Yeah,
makes
exactly
that sort of relationship.
Yeah, it was so casual, but in the sort of sponsorship sense, that was kind of our first gig.
Okay.
Then the second year that we did it was 2013, and we were an actual sponsor of this because they wanted to produce a CD of all the artists on this bill.
Okay. So cost for delivery, you had to produce something for them at your own expenses.
In this case, I was a sponsor because I donated the mixing and mastering of a whole CD to the cause of this festival.
Okay.
And it's called the Rock City Project 2013. You may be able to find it online somewhere. I don't know. Okay. But I reckon I donated somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 hours worth of time into mixing down and mastering that CD. And again, for that, I got a free tent, I got a big banner, I got a shout out, and whatever, it was still pretty casual. It wasn't like, anything big. The fun one though was, a battle of the bands.
There you
Um, at the end of 2013, I can't remember if it was November or December of 2013, but we sponsored a Battle of the Bands in Lakewood, Ohio, I believe, called War in the Warehouse.
Interesting.
And we provided the top prize, which was a 3-song EP, essentially a free 3-song EP for the winner.
Meaning, if whoever won would come to KSD Studios, and then you would
record it for free.
Yeah,
yeah. Which also equated to, I think we ended up putting in 20 to 25 hours on that with the winner of that band. Sure. But we got our exposure. They came to us, recorded their 3-song EP. They liked it. It came out so well, they're like, dude, well, let's just do the rest of the album. So we ended up making money off of it anyway.
So, sponsor return, right?
Exactly.
You sponsored the festival, did a 3-song demo for free. They liked your work so much, you got some business out of it.
ROI, man.
ROI, direct. Yep. Okay. Yeah. First of all, that's an awesome story that you've been on the other side and that you've seen direct return from it, because I want to get into the contract, at least the way that just the whole relationship that's the MacGuffin of the film, right? The thing that's driving the plot forward is this relationship with Noah's Arcade, which, as I mentioned at the top or earlier, Noah's Arcade, Brian Doyle Murray's voice is the first one you hear at the start of the film, which really stands out to me just in the context of this conversation and watching the movie with this, hat on. It's striking that they start with Noah's Arcade at the start of the movie. It's almost like Noah's Arcade presents Wayne's World, the film, not necessarily Wayne's World, the fictional property that's the subject of a real film, right? It's pretty striking. So Noah's Arcade, the scene that they have, and so this is the way that it's sort of positioned, right? So Oliver Communications, rep by Rob Lowe, they bring in Noah's Arcade. At the very start of the film, he's sitting there watching. I have some questions about how late they're actually in bed watching this program, because Wayne's World goes out at 10:30 on Friday, right? And Rob Lowe and whoever he had met the night are already home sitting there watching TV. But it airs at 10:30, and so they're watching Noah's Arcade, and he says while they're watching this ad, and then Wayne's World comes on, he said, "I'm actually looking for something that I can sell to Noah."
He immediately picks up the phone and calls. Calls in.
Yeah, and so he said, I think this is something that we can sell to Vanderhoff." And then his counterpart says, "Do you think it's wise to sell a show that we don't own?" Right. So I want to come back to that, because I've got a category we're going to go through that. But he says, "Do you think it's wise to sell a show that you don't already own?" So there's two things that have to happen here. One, he has to go and convince Wayne to sell his show to him so that he can go market and sell it as an advertising responsible property to Noah's Arcade, right? Because they're having trouble buying into this. And so there's a scene in the film where they break down exactly what the value is, and they say, they're saying this to Noah Vanderhoff. They say, "This is your audience, are the same kids that go to your arcades every weekend." And then Rob Lowe's counterpart says, "These guys aren't phonies. Kids can spot phonies. They're very smart." And again, remembering that Myers is scripting this, so kids are smart, they can spot phonies. And Vanderhoff sort of pushes back on that and says,
I've watched these kids. They're dumb as a box of rocks, more or less.
Yeah, he says they know dick, I think is what he said. Yeah, and then says I watch them, they just sit there and they're not paying attention, right? Yeah. So we can market anything to them, and then from there, he's convinced to sponsor the show, invest a lot of money, and then there are some clues to how they structure this agreement, but the assets in the contract, as it's been broken down.
Yeah, and this is where I have huge questions. I'm just
I'll go through, I guess, sort of line by line what I think the way that this contract is structured, and then whatever sort of financial compensation exists, and then we can dive into our questions about how this is structured. The idea is, okay, these are the kids that are in your suit. So first of all, the challenge here, as it relates to why sponsors and properties enter into relationships, or why there's interest from a sponsor in doing something like Wayne's World, is there's this assumption that if I tie into this audience, and obviously that these are the people that are going to come to my arcade. I watch Wayne's World even now, looking back to 1992. I'm like, these guys are playing music all day long and watching bands and whatever. They're not going to arcades and playing video games. Like the fact that they think they know their audience because they're young and they sell it to Vanderhoff that way is, it's a bit of a shame on you for not recognizing who your audience is, but it also says he doesn't care who his audience is too. At one point he says, like you said, they stand like laboratory rats hitting the feeder bar to get a food pellet. And then he says, as long as they keep pumping in the quarters, who gives a shit? So his perspective of his audience is, who gives a shit as long as they're paying me, right? So they go to him and say, well, these are your audience. These are the people that are paying you. So they give him one spot on a weekly show, and then why don't you come on the show, and then you can update kids on exactly what was new in the arcade, because he sort of brags about, I do my own commercials, and like, well, why don't you just come on the show and then you can talk about it? And so they use that as a selling point. So they give him a spot on Wayne's World.
Right.
They designate him, and Rob Lowe / Benjamin's character pitches it as Noah's Arcade presents Wayne World. So Noah's Arcade is a presenting sponsor of a cable access program. There's a contractually obligated interview, which Rob Lowe talks to Garth about. We'll touch on that in a second.
Right.
And then Noah's Arcade sign is suspended above the set for the entire episode. Mm-hmm. They have a live announcer that's reading, and he says, Wayne's World is brought to you by Noah's Arcade. So there's a live sponsor read introduction.
This is all a throwback, and this is something that we didn't talk about before, but I really want to mention real quick. It doesn't make sense this way in 1992, but I think this was Mike Myers' dig on the way they used to do things back at the onslaught of the big three and the sponsorships that happened in like the 50s and 60s. I think that's where this all ties into.
Yeah, it's definitely reminiscent of, say, variety programming. And when you and I talked about Frozen Caveman Lawyer and how sponsorship originally supported television programming, it paid for a lot of the budgets. And then when things shifted from radio to TV, it suddenly got a lot more expensive to produce the show. So sponsors weren't just, paying outright to pay for an entire show, which is sort of the model.
It used to be one sponsor sponsored the show, and then it became multiples, and then advertising, and then everything just kind of crap at the fan. So
it's a great point. And so the next question I have for you, just in terms of the logistics of it, being a producer and having worked on that side of it, what that would have looked like, because Noah's Arcade, like you said, is the sole sponsor of Wayne's World. They're presenting the episode. It's a throwback to, say, variety shows from decades previously, where there was one sponsor, or even like the soap operas back in the day, where they would actually manufacture.
They would title the program with the sponsor's name in it. Yeah, I mean, that was very, very common.
One of the things I'd like to do in the show is a program from the 1960s that has Wells Fargo in the title. And it's about a Wells Fargo claims inspector that travels across the West. I'd never heard of it. I found it on Freevee or Tubi or one of those free pay television shows, but I'd never heard of it. It's fascinating that it's actually about a Wells Fargo employee, and Wells Fargo gets branding all over it. So it was truly content created by and definitely paid for Wells Fargo, although I haven't done any research into that, but I'd love to do that on this podcast at some point. But yeah, you're right. That was something that was the point of, sponsoring the show to begin with, is you have prominent brand recognition through the whole thing, which is what they're trying to do for Noah's Arcade. So the live read is, kind of a throwback to that. So then there was a sponsor ad that they were going to run after the verbal live read. So when they steamroll Wayne, because he doesn't know what he signed, right? They give him, well, we mentioned this earlier, but they give each of them $5,000. So there's a $10,000 signing bonus. So they basically sign over the rights to their show to Oliver Communications, right? And you had said, how many impressions does that have, et cetera. So Oliver Communications broadcasts out of the Leo Burnett building in real life. Oliver Communications buys the show. They recreate Wayne's Basement on the show. They bring them onto the set. They bring Noah onto the set and his wife to comedic effect, so that they could, see what they were paying for, so to speak. And they had built this whole set modeled after the basement in Aurora, Illinois. Even the setting had moved to a real studio in downtown Chicago. And then Noah's Arcade has branding all over the place, and they do a live read before it starts. They do an immediate interview with the sponsor, then they go to a sponsor ad after the break. So when I was talking about sort of, ham-fisting sponsorship onto something that it isn't necessarily needed, it completely corporatized the show. Now it's literally sponsored from the second they walk in. Like everything on that is Noah's Arcade. And I think we can both agree that not only is that not a fit, that's not the way to integrate a sponsor into content that you're creating. And there's more control over that.
At least not in 1992 or anytime since then.
No. I mean, okay, so that's a good segue into the next category, because it's going to go into how this deal was negotiated and what they should have done. And there are some very real life lessons that you can take from here. And it's different than what I would consider to be like our key takeaways, where we're talking about like what can you learn and apply to your sponsorship career from this particular type of property or as it's presented in the film. Like those are more like general takeaways just to the entire discussion. These are more very specific lessons that can be learned from the sales process, because in my experience, these are things that really happen, and I'm calling it, what would Noah Vanderhoff do?
You want your carpet tomorrow? Hey, Al, get this. They want delivery tomorrow. You kidding? Come on.
You really want your new carpet tomorrow? Okay, just call Empire today. I promise you'll have your new carpet tomorrow. Not only that, but with your good credit, you won't make a payment for 90 days.
Oh, boy. Delivery tomorrow? Come on, will you?
588-2300 Empire.
Empire today, carpet tomorrow.
So the goal for this category is Noah Vanderhoff is kind of an amalgam of folks that I've encountered in the industry over 20 years at this point, and also Rob Lowe's approach and Noah Vanderhoff agreeing to it and what his goals are for sponsoring and who's making money and how the transaction is created. And I wanted to go through some of the things here because I think this is important for people if you're pursuing sponsorship for the first time and you work with anyone who's a professional salesperson. There's a lot of high pressure sales tactics in this that are very real things. And I want to kind of go through those. So the first thing I want to go back to, is it wise to sell a show that we don't own, right? They're given a warning, right? They don't own the rights to the property that they're selling. So they go to Wayne and say, we've got a sponsor that's interested if you sign on with us, and then that sponsor will pay you to do what you love. And then he goes to Noah's Arcade and says, we've got this show that has the audience that you want, and if you sponsor it, then you'll be able to have access to those laboratory rats, as he calls them, that come into your Noah's Arcade. This is your audience, right? That's what he tells them. So right now they're in the middle of the transaction as, in this case, the broadcaster, but he's also the sales director for the broadcaster. And so what he has to do from this point forward, he has to buy Wayne's World and then he has to sell it. So there's two contracts, right? One is the one that he gives to Wayne and Garth and says, you need to review this, and here's $5,000. And Garth has a quick aside where he pretends to drop a pen, and he said, do you think this is weird? He just who just shows up at a bar with contracts, right? And so tells them that their artist pulls out the money and then says, do you want to review this? And Wayne does sort of like a jokey review thing. So first of all, have I ever encountered a Noah Vanderhoff where there was someone who was selling something that they didn't own yet in order to get interest so they could go get a sponsor? Or have they gone and talked to a sponsor and saying, if we go get this client, that we're going to pull you in and then you're going to deliver this audience? Has the real world Noah Vanderhoff done that in the past? Absolutely. So it's something to watch out for. A good question, if you're going to pursue this for the first time, and let's say you're a sponsor or it's KSD Studios sponsoring a music festival, the first question you should ask is if they own the rights to what they're selling. Because what happens sometimes, especially baked into contracts, is there'll be this, there'll be different audiences that they tie into where it says like, oh, we have all this social media following, or we're going to get all this press coverage, or we're working with such and such media partner, and then they have this audience, and this is all part of this experience we're creating. And one of the things that I, as an analyst, would look for when I go through this contracts is say, like, all right, what audiences do they actually quote unquote own, right? What audiences are theirs? What assets are theirs? And what are they sort of padding the resume with to get sponsor interest? Because what you really have to focus on is what's being delivered, right? At the end of the day, what can you contractually guarantee is going to be delivered? And so they're tying into Wayne's audience from Cable 10, but he doesn't own that show. He has to go buy it in order for Noah's Arcade to contract with him. He has to own the IP. And until Oliver Communications owns that, he doesn't have anything to sell to him.
Yeah.
And conversely, Noah's Arcade can't contract with Oliver Communications around a show that they don't own. And so there's some salesmanship, we'll call it, from both sides where, in the real world, would, the Noah Vanderhoff potentially sell something that way? I've seen it happen. I'll put it that way. The other thing, lying about sponsor interest to sign clients. What would Noah Vanderhoff do? 100%. If you're a salesperson and you're working with, I've seen it happen. If you're working with Noah Vanderhoff as a client, and this is something I noticed too, Rob Lowe, halfway through his pitch, flips the script on him to make him think it's his idea. Right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, no, totally. This is a great idea that you should totally sponsor the show. And then you're going to deliver an audience like we fully support. And he goes, oh, okay, well, I'll have to think about this. And they walk him out of the room, but they flip it on him to make him think it's his idea. So there's some agency on his side because of who he is as a personality.
He's just dumb enough to fall for it. That's the thing.
Right. Because they flatter him and make him think it's his idea. And they use that because of who he is as, frankly, a CEO and a leader. So he, in reference to Noah Vanderhoff's, character as a character, right? Like what his value system is. When he first sits down before they start rolling and taping Wayne's World, he sits down to visit the set and he's talking to Wayne. All right. So we've already established Wayne Campbell's a metalhead going back, years in Mike Myers' mind, but also on the show. And he sits down and starts talking about, I saw Pong once in an airport and I realized that this is what the kids wanted these days, or however he frames that. And then he goes, builds an empire around it, and he's like, now I'm a millionaire. So first of all, know your audience. Why would Wayne care? That's obviously not who Wayne is, but that's who Vanderhoff is. And so they make him think it's his idea, at least Oliver Communications does. So does that kind of flattery in a sales strategy work sometimes? Yes. So what would Noah Vanderhoff do? Would he fall for that? Yeah, Noah Vanderhoff would fall for something like that. Okay, next one I have. Feel free to jump in here. I don't mean to just
no. This is good. I like it.
Not really reading the contract or providing an opportunity to peruse the contract, knowing that the client isn't going to read it. I think the takeaway there, what would Noah Vanderhoff do? Would he hand you a contract and ask you to sign it without reading it? 100%. I have seen that happen. I've seen it with employment contracts in the past. I had a colleague once.
Dude, who reads the fine print?
Well, that's the thing, is somebody has to read the fine print at some point besides the lawyers. And if you don't engage legal counsel to review your contract, this being like a lesson learned. So it's one thing just to put things on paper, but frankly, getting into the logistics a little bit, I wouldn't send a draft of a contract to anybody that wasn't a PDF form. I mean, you can still edit PDFs now. It's pretty easy to do that, but either send it with track changes so that you can see what people's red lines are when you're negotiating a contract back and forth, but definitely have legal counsel weigh in on it. And what Wayne does where he starts like, oh yeah, this is interesting. You make some really great points here. And he sort of makes a joke about it.
Yeah.
That he's not really reading the contract. And then that's, Garth breaking the fourth wall. And then they sign on the dotted line because there's cash in front of him. He gets, blinded by the money and doesn't really read the terms. And then when he gets on set, realizes what he's done, to the art that he's created. And that's when he pushes back. And this is another thing that I was going to note in terms of a contract violation. So Rob Lowe / Benjamin's character tells him he publicly humiliated the sponsor and they fire him. So could that actually happen? Would Noah Vanderhoff leverage his affiliation with the property to remove the talent and put somebody in there that's friendly to the sponsor if he's paying for it? Contractually, yeah, it's possible that could happen.
Yes, I would guess
that's one of the terms that were in there that he didn't really pay attention to. So always make sure you read the contract. And I think everybody's, guilty of sort of,
glazed over it a little bit,
glossed over the details, the fine print, but you need to have somebody that actually pay attention to it. So these are all things that, like I said, what would Noah Vanderhoff do? You have to pay attention if you're working with someone that has some sales experience, because a lot of the things that they show in here, the high pressure sales tactics, putting the money in front of somebody and then showing them the contract and
dangle that carrot,
flattering their ego to get them to sign something, like all of that is very real sales strategy. And so if anyone on the sales side or on the property side or on the sponsor side needs to look for things, like always make sure you know who owns the IP that you're buying the rights to, and make sure it's your partner. First of all, make sure you read all the fine print, make sure as a property, you know exactly what you're agreeing to and what sort of sponsor recognition needs to be included in that contract. And just as a general takeaway, make sure that it's the right partner, but also make sure that you're looking out for those things that might be less than above board, because there are, unfortunately, the Noah Vanderhoffs that are out there. Yeah. So just know when you're with
everything about this sponsorship in Wayne's World violates everything you just said.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, and that's the thing is, I know it's played for comedic effect, but the Noah Vanderhoffs of the world are out there and do this kind of stuff when they're trying to get a deal done, because they're based on commission. They're salespeople. These are sales tactics, and there's nothing. Yeah, I don't say there's anything unethical about what they're doing. It's just salesmanship. But if you're not paying attention to what you're signing, then you get into jams like Wayne's World gets in this movie where he has a sponsor.
Well, shame on you.
That he basically, sacrificed control over his own creative content to the sponsor, and that's not what is going to make not only a successful sponsorship, but also, make for good programming for him and a decision. He would have had more control over that if he had paid attention to the contract. He could have negotiated some of those elements, and he didn't. So that's on Wayne to do that for not knowing what he was dealing with in his inexperience, but they also manipulate him a little bit because he doesn't know that, right? They even distract him with the tickets to Milwaukee, and they do the Laverne and Shirley bit, and then what are we doing? We need to get to the show, right? And there's that's a very real tactic that I've seen occur. So just for folks that are pursuing this for the first time, if you're listening, heads up, watch out for the Noah Vanderhoffs. All right, let's move on.
You've selected the finest replacement window that money can buy.
These people know what they want. Why? Because before they bought replacement windows, they sent for this free book. It's got all the questions answered on prime replacement windows, and they're going to find peace of mind with Super Sage Window Company. So if you're serious about replacement windows, call 583-4855, and I'll send you this book. Better yet, I'll bring it myself. We'll get serious together. Call Super Sage at 583-4855. Super Sage.
As we're calling it, the sellout scene. And that's not in relation to any of those brands that obviously received a lot of airtime. There's actually a site online that tracked exactly how much logo exposure each of those brands had during that scene and why it's a successful example of product placement. So the brands that were in that scene, as we mentioned, it's Pizza Hut, Doritos, Reebok, Newprin, Little Yellow Different. If you're not familiar with the brand, I don't think they're around anymore, Pepsi and Mountain Dew. And so in that scene, and this is the thing that I want to talk about as it relates to the whole concept of selling out, just looking at the text itself of the script, Mike Myers says, "Contractor, no, I will not bow to any sponsor." And Ben tells him, well, that's kind of the nature of the beast. And he said, it might be the nature of the beast, but it doesn't include selling out, right? That very exact context. And he said, and then Garth says, it's people only do things because they get paid. It makes me sad. Now, if you take that out of the context of either of the characters and you just read that, right? As people just do stuff because they get paid, it's sad. This is Mike Myers' debut film for Saturday Night Live, and it's one of SNL Films' biggest successes, right?
Right.
And so the context of that is we're recognizing these brands, but it might be the nature of the beast that we need to have this corporate involvement. And unfortunately, the way they talk about it is, this is the reason why we do this, and it just makes me sad that I have to. Now, I want to come back to something, and I was going to use this as sort of food for thought, but I think we can do it now as it relates to this particular context. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this. Okay. So Wayne's World was famous for doing movie reviews. In fact, the first Wayne's World episode is basically them doing movie reviews where it's Wayne gives some sort of really articulate commentary on what the film was actually about, and then Garth would say it sucked, and they'd make a joke about it. So it's very much doing the Johnny Carson, Ed McMahon routine where there's a really pithy thought and then there's a one-liner zinger, and that was how they structured their movie reviews. But they're always reviewing somebody else's film. At the end of Wayne's World, Wayne reviews his own film, and he's talking to the audience, breaking the fourth wall as the end credits are rolling. So this is his review of the movie that he created. And remember, this is Wayne Campbell, played by Mike Myers, who wrote the script for Wayne's World featuring Wayne Campbell. And so this is Mike Myers writing this, right? He's criticizing his own work. He says, "We hope you found it entertaining, whimsical, and yet relevant, with an underlying revisionist conceit that belied the film's emotional attachments to the subject matter." So when I was watching this, I was just planning to watch it through the scene where essentially Wayne gets fired, because after that, the movie sort of shifts gears and it's him like pursuing Cassandra and we're going to go do the Scooby-Doo ending, and it sort of becomes more jokey. But up until that point, that was where most of the corporate sponsor recognition is. And then the film sort of like shifts gears, right? Like the fake film.
Yeah, yeah.
So I told my wife, who wanted to watch something else while I'm sitting here going through this for this podcast, and I said, I'm just going to watch it through that scene and then I'll be done. What I didn't realize is that scene ends at like 1:12 out of an hour 30 runtime. It's like an hour and 12 minutes in is where that scene ends. So when he says an underlying revisionist conceit that belies the film's emotional attachments to the subject matter, the first 2/3 or more of the movie are about the cost of fame, as we talked about at the top.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So his emotional attachment to the subject matter is what it's cost him to be successful. And there's a lot of like rumors in Hollywood. You know, I don't know the man personally, you know, Mike Myers. I don't know him. I've never met anybody that knows him. But if, you know, you read Hollywood industry trade publications, they're talking about how difficult Mike Myers became to work with, especially when he was doing like the Austin Powers films. He got kind of a bad reputation for that. And that's not the only actor that's ever had a bad reputation for people not wanting to work with them and that sort of thing. It happens. And it's hard to know whether that stuff is truthful or not. But he's writing his first successful film, and this is the movie that makes him. And Austin Powers and all that other stuff that he had created over his career that he had been workshopping for years, he's now become successful. Do you think, based on what he said, so the other thing I want to touch on before you answer this, the underlying revisionist conceit, the basement in Wayne's World is very similar to the set of It's Only Rock and Roll back from the late 80s and early 90s, that variety show when Wayne Cable first showed up. It's like he recreated that, and then they, in the context of the film, recreate it in the Leo Burnett building / Oliver Communications. This recreation.
It's kind of like he took more than just his character. He kind of took like the character and the setting and everything about that with him.
Right. That's the revision, right? The revisionist element to it is, here's the past 10 years of this Wayne Campbell character all synthesized into this one basement in the show. And then it's hiding the fact that he's emotionally attached to the fact of what it's cost him to be successful. And now I'm thinking, after watching this movie, one, I came away with this very bittersweet feeling about his relationship to brands and what his experiences had been, because it seems like this is sort of him putting it all on the page, and then what it's cost him to get to where he is. And then later in his career, having this, you know, less than stellar reputation on set. If all this is sort of originating from bad interactions with brands and what he had to do, you know, the sellout anxiety, and how that informed all of his work and what he had to do to be successful. Like, do you think all of this that we're talking about today, do you think it has impacted him and soured his relationship to his own art?
I think it's difficult to say, because all the accounts that I've been able to find and read about Wayne's World tell me that during Wayne's World, he was already difficult to work with. He was, for the lack of a better term, he was a diva. I read multiple accounts from different sources that he and Dana Carvey did not get along at all. I read multiple accounts from different sources that he and the director did not get along at all, and that's why she wasn't asked to come back for Wayne's World 2. Legendary. I read from multiple sources that he threatened to quit Wayne's World if they didn't do Bohemian Rhapsody instead of I think Welcome to the Jungle, Guns N' Roses. I think was slated to be the headbanging scene in the car, but
really,
but Mike Myers insisted it be Bohemian Rhapsody and threatened to quit if it wasn't. So they gave in. So my educated-ish, somewhat educated opinion is that ending where he does the little heartfelt review of his own work, I think was more farcical than realistic.
Okay.
Honestly, because I from all accounts that I can tell, he was already a diva at that point, and maybe he was being truthful a little bit about it, but I don't think he cared by then. So maybe yes and maybe no. So maybe he did. Maybe it was truthful, but at that point he didn't care anymore.
Okay, so he spends 10 years developing this character, and what you're saying is Myers kind of crossed the Rubicon at some point way before he made Wayne's World, so all of the gleeful corporate sellout stuff, it might have bothered him at one point, but by the time he's making the movie, he's already beyond that point, and he's just doing what he thinks is funny.
I guess that's pretty much the synopsis of, or that's basically what I got out of it. Yeah.
It's a fascinating take, though, right? What
it is.
At some point, it seems like it's fair to say at some point, he had some sort of interactions with corporate influence over what he was trying to do. And I mean, I believe at some point had to make some sort of concession, because the way that he's describing it, like I said, the sales tactics and things, like he's encountered that at some point before to be able to write
he's
it.
obviously got to be educated about it.
So at some point, something influenced what he was doing. And, based on what you just said, I think it's a good observation that he's probably reached a point where if he's not made his peace with it, he's at least accepted it. And then he's making a joke about it in a script that he probably wrote, years before.
Yeah.
And now his behavior on set, as you call it, his diva behavior as an actor might have influenced, people's perception of him. Like Penelope Spheris, as you mentioned, very famously didn't get invited back for the sequel because they didn't get along and butted heads. And so maybe he'd already crossed the line at that point. But it's interesting to think that at some point, as an artist, something soured his opinion of brands. And it's really fascinating to see how well brands were tied into this film and how much success they had. You mentioned Bohemian Rhapsody not being the original song that was slated for the film. That article I mentioned earlier that mentioned all of those brands, the most successful product placement that came out of that was Bohemian Rhapsody and then Foxy Lady, because there's an uptick in popularity for both Hendrix and Queen in particular.
What I understand is that Bohemian Rhapsody went from nowhere to back on the top 40 charts or something like that after the film.
Juiced it. Yeah. So the most popular brand coming out of this film weren't any of the corporate brands, it was Queen. Bohemian Rhapsody as a Queen property got the most brand value out of associating themselves with the film, which is fascinating that, per our conversation, out of all of the corporate involvement that we've talked about for this movie and the idea of selling out, that the most relevant and successful brand incorporation into a film about music was a music property.
Yep.
Bohemian Rhapsody. So it seems like it's a fitting irony that despite all the money that was thrown at the recognition for the film, the Bohemian Rhapsody got the most value out of it. That's incredible.
Yeah, that is crazy.
All right, let's get into false market value. So I did some research into Cable 10, just to see what kind of programming they would do. So in 1992 and any other time since, would something like Wayne's World actually air on that network? And so I did a lot of research into, as it's known now on Comcast, it's Aurora Community Television, and it's still Channel 10, right? As it was back in 1992. So I was looking at, all right, Channel 10, what actually airs on there on, say, like Friday or Saturday night. The most interesting one I found, so it's what you would expect for public access cable programming. During the days, there's a couple, religious themed shows early on in the morning. There's some variety shows in the afternoon. They do reruns during prime time. And then the one that I found interesting on Saturday night, and a shout out to this guy. So there was a horror anthology late night show that used to air, and I don't know when it stopped, but I found a schedule from 2009 on Channel 10, and it was called The Bone Jangler. And the guy's last name is Jangler, and he's a horror host, and he would show films late at night on Saturday night on Aurora Public Access Television, which I think is awesome. And now Aurora Community Television has their own podcast, which is a morning show that they do. They do shows for business leaders where they provide lessons for local entrepreneurs and things like that. So it's quality local content for people that live in the Aurora community. Didn't see anything that was similar to Wayne's World, and it wasn't necessarily music themed, but at least we have some sort of point of reference where we can say, like, all right, there was a horror anthology that used to run at night. So it makes sense that
something alternative in nature.
Yeah. I mean, in 1992, would Wayne's World have self-produced a show that, showed up at 10:30 at night, and would they air it and, pay for it all themselves? Yeah, 100%. That's totally accurate. So credit out to the SNL writers and Mike Myers for just come up with that whole concept. So then I wanted to look at, okay, because initially I was thinking when you and I talked about this, is like, let's figure out what this would be on local public access television. And as it turns out, didn't think, Oliver Communications bought it, and then they started broadcasting out of downtown. So then I started researching, okay, in 1992, who's the real analog for Oliver Communications? And I think I found the answer, because there are still some local networks that are Chicago-owned that have their own cable channel on Comcast in that market. And, I used to watch a lot of them. I mean, everybody watches, the U, which is the CW network. It's WCIU. That's a local broadcast channel, and that has all your local CW shows that used to air. And like I said, watching TV late at night, I would come across not like Wayne's World, but just reruns of stuff that they would show on these local networks. But Oliver Communications. So in 1987 up until 1988, one of those cable channels, which is local in origin in the Chicagoland area, is called Channel 50, and the station sign is WPWR. So WPWR in 1987. The original parent station, and there's some history if you want to look online into how the ownership changed hands for the station, but the original ownership group company started in Aurora. And in 1987, it became the third independent station in downtown Chicago behind WGN, which is Channel 9, and that's the home of the Cubs, and then the future sister station for My 50, which is WFLD, which is Channel 32. And so those are actual cable channel local origin networks. But that would have happened in 87, 88. And then within a couple of years, My 50 was the third largest independent television station in Chicagoland by, say, 1990. That was behind, WGN, and then what eventually became its affiliate sister station. So I think the real life Oliver Communications would have been My 50 WPWR, and I think that's where Wayne's World would have aired. Now, as it relates back to Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer, we went through in that episode what that model looked like in 1991 and how things had changed. So where we landed with that, and we had referenced, there's a Procter & Gamble ad where they were trying to reach adult males, and they were broadcasting in local markets. And so basically, Noah's Arcade, the whole intention behind their presenting sponsorship of something like Wayne's World, like let's say WPWR really was the station that would have aired that programming. And they go through a couple other ones in the movie, other things that they produce for that network. But if that's broadcast out of Chicagoland downtown in 1992, then the corporate involvement, especially at night, like post prime time, would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of what some of those ads we had referenced that Procter & Gamble was running on, local networks, which in 1991, I think we had estimated had been somewhere like $38,000 for like a 30-second spot or like a lead into a program back in 1991. Right. This is 92. So figure if that was going to be on that network, it's probably somewhere between $25,000 or $50,000, depending on the costs associated with developing the show, and then whatever commission Benjamin was making on buying a local.
Show. One of my questions was like, what was it actually worth to Benjamin, and to Oliver Communications? Like, what were they getting out of it?
Well, right. Well, look, Ben doesn't make any money buying the show from Cable 10. Right. He makes money on selling it to Noah's Arcade. So he has to recoup the $10K he spent to get them to sign over the show to him to begin with. And then they have to produce the show. We know that the major brands that are advertising on local networks all over the place in the early 90s would have been, $35,000 just for simple math. So figure he has to make $10,000 on top of that, and it's running late night, so it's going to be a little less valuable, but we know it's reaching the audience. So I'm just thinking from what Noah Vanderhoff would have paid to do that show, including recreating a basement on the set and all the signage that they produce and all of that stuff, that would have fallen somewhere within that range. But nowadays, that's not on that channel, right? They don't buy something like Wayne's World and put it on there. So what I'm curious to know, doing some of the research that you did, and I looked at this too, any of those local access programs, like let's say the Bone Jangler was going to go get a sponsor. Yeah. The rules for sponsorship on public access television is basically you pay for the cost to produce the show, right? And you give them like a spot on air, and there's some guidelines around that. If you look at the Naperville TV station that's local public access, or Aurora, what it looks like now. So in and around the Chicagoland area, that generally seems to be how it works, is they're basically paying for your production costs or whatever. And you coming from that world, I'm curious to know if we're going to do something like Wayne's World now on Cable 10, seeing sort of the setup they had in the studio there and like how they were producing that. What do you think a sponsor would pay to basically cover the cost to do an episode of Wayne's World and then make it serialized?
Okay, I have two answers for that. For cable access, for something close and local, like for the Aurora viewing area, let's just say for Aurora, Illinois, in 1992, the population was 103,276.
Right.
Okay. And in 1992, for that population, how many of those people actually had cable, and how, like, so what is your actual impression of that? What kind of impressions are we talking with there?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a publication I found that was talking about public access television, and it was making the case that public access television really has the same type of viewership numbers that anything else that airs on cable does, because people could change channels and the major programs gets kind of like all lumped together. But what they said was that some of those local affiliates get a rating score of about 3.5, which means you're looking at about 3.5% of the viewing audience of the local TV households. Now, I don't know how many viewing, like the 103,000 people, I don't know how many viewing households that actually is, but figure 2 to 3%. So if you're at 103,000, you're talking about, 1% being a little over 1,000. You're talking about maybe, 2,000, 3,000 people that are watching Wayne's World in 1992 and now, right?
Yeah. Okay, so fast forward to now. From a cable perspective, and I actually I worked in a cable television studio in one of my college internships.
Oh man, that's perfect.
For 2 years back in the day. And keep in mind, this was over 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago. I was unpaid, but I know that the local station, Adelphia Cable is the name of the company, and Adelphia got bought by Time Warner, and then Time Warner got bought by whoever, and now they're Spectrum and blah blah blah. But Adelphia was still like a regional cable provider for the Northeast Ohio area.
Okay,
we were talking about the talent, because I helped produce one of the shows that I helped produce was a show called More Sports and Less Levine. The name of the host was Les Levine, and it was a talk show about sports, and he would just bring on all these local sports commentator guys and former athletes and stuff like that, and they talk about these games and whatever, blah 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 blah. And me not being a sports person, I was like, this is like the lamest thing I've ever had to listen to. But I was in the production end of it. Okay, so we're talking about, if we leave talent aside, if we leave, Les Levine's, whatever he's getting paid and whatever he's paying his guests, if he's paying them, and I don't know. But we're talking about 3 live camera operators. Okay. Yep. We've got a live floor director.
Yep.
Okay. That's 4 people on the floor just right there.
Okay.
What we see as Noah's Arcades presents Wayne's World. Okay. All right. The production that you see in the studio is most like what I've experienced in a TV studio myself. Okay. So this is the anecdote that I'm referring to here. So so you've got 3 live.
I was looking at it from like the Noah's Arcade presents Wayne's World Oliver Communications program. I was looking at that as just they probably throw some consumer brands in while they were running that, in addition to Noah's Arcade, but they probably got Noah's Arcade to pay more than what he was actually getting in terms of value and audience.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine how much Noah Vanderhoff like would have had to put out to get this sponsorship. It doesn't. That's why it doesn't make any sense, because like
enough that they would bring him down to the set to say, we want to see where your money's going, and they show him like an exact recreation of Wayne Campbell's mom's basement, which in itself is an achievement, but to get all those details right, that probably cost a fortune, right? To do that. And he has the $10,000 he paid for the show. to account for before he makes any sort of profit and or commission.
You're probably talking about 10 grand to 15 grand for that set. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. But and looking at it from a production standpoint, this is perfect. So go on. Like, tell me what this would have actually cost before they had to figure out if they made a profit.
So set. Let's just say, for sake of argument, you dropped 15 grand recreating this for your set.
Yeah.
You've got 3 live camera operators. You've got a floor director, and this is the guy who's doing the countdown: 5, 4, 3.
Right.
And he's pointing to the cameras. He's directing the talent to the correct cameras, telling them when they're on, telling them, where to look, who to talk to, when they're off, blah, blah, blah. You've got control room. Okay. So you've got your technical director, who is the guy who actually pushes the buttons on the video switcher and does the different takes of each camera and chroma key and goes to commercial, like blah, 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 blah. Then you've got the guy who's running the VTRs. So any ads, any spots, any pre-recorded anything you've got to have an operator for that.
This is so great.
All right. So there's another guy. Okay. And then you've got the sound guy. Okay. And this isn't the guy on the floor, like holding the mic. If there was a guy that's holding a mic on the floor, if you do, then you've got another guy on the floor. You've got the boom operator. Okay. But you've got the guy in the control room on the soundboard mixing live. Okay. You've got that guy. Okay. You've got the camera setup guy. Okay, and this is a guy that's separate from everybody else, and I don't forgive me, I don't remember the technical name for this, but
this is great content. Just keep going.
There somebody has to be responsible for setting up and color balancing and white balancing and like making sure that everything in the studio looks the same shot to shot.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got somebody for that, and then you've got the coffee boy. Okay. Because there is one of those. No, like legit. So you've got all these people you got to pay. Oh, and then you've got the producer.
Yeah.
Okay. He doesn't even push any buttons or do anything. He's just the producer.
Right.
Or she.
He's sitting up in the studio giggling. Yeah.
He's the one that's calling the shots. So
regardless,
but he's not actually pushing any buttons or like providing any sort of technical function.
Right.
All right. So you've got all these people you got to pay. How many people did I just list out? 3,
I couldn't even tell you. It's a lot.
You've got 15 to 20 people involved in the production of this half-hour spoof show. Okay. Right. Now I'm going to say this only because I did not get paid as an intern at this station, but I know that the lead floor director was making, and this is in 2002, 2003 ish era. They were making $17 an hour, and that's not a super, super important role. Okay. So you think kind of a baseline, obviously the coffee person, the lackey, for lack of a better term, unintended,
like the grip that's running.
They're getting $10 an hour or something. Right. And everything up from there is going to be higher and higher and higher. And obviously the producer's making the biggest chunk. So just say, let's call $20 as the median pay for your studio crew. All right.
Who are putting all this time in for a show that lasts 10 minutes, right? If you look at the ACTV, the Aurora television station now, there's still programs that only run 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is,
So
I'm talking about my experience with this particular show that I'm talking about was a 30-minute show.
Oh, okay.
But just say $20 an hour is the median pay, and you've got 20 people.
Yep.
All right. So for half an hour, call it what it is, plus whatever the set costs.
Yep.
Okay.
10 to 15 grand.
So that's per show.
Right.
I mean, obviously the set is a one-time thing, but per show, you're dropping money every time.
Yeah.
And that was 20 years ago.
Right.
And that's cable. We're not talking about a network.
Right. So what do you think,
Plausibly, let's just say that now, let's say it goes up, just hypothetically, let's say it goes up 50% for cable. Double that, I would say, probably is where you're talking about the neighborhood for an actual network or non-local cable type channel.
Okay.
Might get you in the ballpark.
Okay. So figure, we're looking at, in 1992, let's say 15 grand to build the set, $10,000, all those production costs. I mean, what do you think all in just to produce that first episode of Wayne's World at Oliver Communications? Just, we don't have to be exact here, but, what ballpark figure, how much, if they're passing all this cost through to Noah, what does that look like?
If Noah's paying for all of this, all right, let's just say average salary for around about the time, plus $15,000 for the set, plus the $10,000 advance that Benjamin gave him, because Noah's paying for that, whether he knew it or not.
Right.
That first episode, I reckon, would have cost in the neighborhood of $25,000, $26,000.
Okay. So within the ballpark, I had sort of guesstimated just based on what ads went for during that same airtime. We assumed it'd be a little bit less, with checks and balances. It's on later at night than prime time, but, it said somewhere between 25 and 50. Looks like it's a little bit on the lower end, but figure, let's say for the premium cable show broadcast out of downtown Chicago, out of Oliver Communications building in 1992, just to produce that first episode was $25,000, and they sold Noah a series. So if he's going to get recognized and those same assets that we listed earlier, where it's, Noah's Arcade suspended over the stage and then the live reads on air, the ad that's being plugged in between there, how many of those do you think that they did? Do you think if it's a weekly show, he did all 52 weeks for Wayne's World?
Like paid up front? I don't know.
I agree with you. I don't really know either, but what I think, if I'm Noah, he was sort of soft on the idea to begin with, and they used clever trickery to get him to agree to it. He's paying for all the initial production costs. That first show is $25,000. I'm assuming the costs drop off after that, right? So figure $25,000 for the first one, deduct out the signing bonus that he gave them, and deduct out
and the cost of the set. I mean, you've got some general overhead with equipment and tape and this, that, and the other thing. And if you're running ads and blah, 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 you've got some cost built in there, but I would say probably just based on a little bit of somewhat educated math, you might be looking at $1,000 per episode after that.
Okay. That's even better. So I'm going to guess with all of the upfront cost, he would have at least done a few months worth of airtime to see if he's getting the type of return that he needed, right? Because he's ultimately trying to drive the people that watch that program into his arcade, right? And you kind of it's almost inferred because they bring him onto the set to show him what his money's paying for. So it's like it sounds like there's a deal there. There's sure.
It's not like he's just paying for one episode and then he's going to see if he likes it or something. Like filming a pilot and then they move it and they roll it out in production, and then there's additional monies that are triggered, which I think is probably how they would structure that. So, okay. So let's say it's $1,000 beyond every other episode. Let's say he does a 3-month initial term. Okay. So that'd be 11 weeks. That's $11,000. So in 1992, his deal for that, right, his initial 3-month run, if we assume that that's the term, right, he didn't do an entire year, but he did a quarter, say, right, to at least see what sort of return he gets on that. I have that at $37,000, which is pretty much exactly what P&G was paying to have its ads on a Friday, Saturday night. So it's interesting we came back to that exact number. So I feel
feel pretty confident we were not only right about Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer, but we're right about this. So that's awesome that you did that, because that is exactly when you do like an analysis, the kind of stuff you have to look at, right? Cost of delivery. What are they using the sponsorship for? How much exposure is he getting? We don't know what, Wayne's World viewership was, but we know it's pretty high because like kids love this show. So let's assume it's pretty high, but even for a cable network, you're getting maybe 2 to 3% of the audience.
Yeah.
You're driving those people into Noah's Arcade all over Chicagoland, which is where he says his presence is. And then he put a significant amount of cost up front to get the show produced, but he's paying like $1,000 an episode after that to reach, say, 2,000 to 3,000 people total. If every single one of those go to Noah's Arcadium once, then he's looking at, a 3-to-1 return on the high end, somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1 return, which is pretty reasonable at that time. Now, here's the fun question. The self-production out of Wayne's Basement, how much does that actually cost? I mean...
Okay, well, like...
Just quickly, and then we can get into, like, takeaways. But,
let's assume, for sake of argument, that... Okay, it being a cable access... self-produced, like he's using his metalhead band buddies as his cameramen and stuff like that. Like,
we're definitely working for beer money or free.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the van came to his house and they were using the cable channel's cameras,
right,
to produce the show. So I don't know if they were paying for that or not. If they were paying us some sort of rental fee, I can't imagine it was that much. Right. I mean, if he's say he's doing a half an hour show, which I don't know, I really don't know how long the episodes were. Like, I don't know how long Wayne's World was.
Let's say it's 15 minutes. That seems to be pretty consistent for like a low budget production that is on a local cable network now. They still do 15-minute programs, right? For self-producing something. So let's just say it's 15 minutes on the low end.
If the guy driving the van and providing the equipment is subsidized by the cable channel somehow through advertising or some other whatever, they might have done the show for free. Yeah. They might have just done the show and like it was just something fun and stupid to do.
All right.
It is plausible that they didn't pay anything to do it.
So then, you had mentioned this earlier, missed opportunities.
Yes.
Noah's Arcade, we agree it's the wrong fit. Let's just go to missed opportunities real quick, and I want to come back to the comment.
I'm Jim Krause from Buick Motor Division. You know Chicago is Buick's #1 market, and it's my job to keep it that way. That's why I convinced my bosses at the factory to come up with a special shipment of Buick courtesy cards for the Western and Ameritech Opens. Now these cards are on sale at your better Buick dealer. Each has been driven only 100 miles or so, but they can't be sold as new. Hey, with savings like these, you'll know what lowering your handicap really means.
Make a play for these courtesy Buicks before they're gone.
Okay, the only one I really feel is worth mentioning is Fender.
Yeah, who should have been there, right? Who should have sponsored the show?
Fender should have sponsored that show.
Totally.
And Wayne would have got what he wanted.
For free.
Fender would have exactly. And Fender would have had some exposure. That would have been a good deal. It would have been, and it would have been cheap for Fender it would have been cheap for Fender. It wasn't so cheap for Vanderhoff. It would have been cheap for Fender. That would have been a drop in the bucket. That would have been an easy sell. And because of the audience, their audience was not Noah Vanderhoff's arcade kids.
No,
it wasn't.
No.
It was like, college and early 20s rocker partiers. That's who watched it and enjoyed it and got anything out of it. That would have been perfect for Fender. That would have been perfect.
Yep.
Missed opportunity.
So I completely agree with you. And the most significant change, you mentioned this earlier, Fender isn't really a heavy metal guitar, but that's Wayne's preference. So let's say Fender sponsors that show. He just swaps out what guitar he plays during the intro.
Right.
It's a Strat. That's
and he'll love it.
Yeah, and he'll love every second of it. It's integrated into the show. It's already a brand that he loves. This sort of, ties into influencer culture now. he would be promoting something that he lives as a lifestyle brand, right? Like he's a Fender guy.
Yeah.
And for those of you who aren't musicians, you have a preference and you really never change. I knew somebody that was a Gibson guitar guy. He's never going to change. He doesn't like playing Fenders. He likes that the neck's a little bit wider. He's got bigger hands, so he can, the fingering on the neck isn't a problem for him. For me, I have a wide palm and shorter fingers, so a Fender was what I played because it was more comfortable for me to like actually articulate it, when I'm playing different notes and things on a Fender. Same thing with like playing a bass, the neck isn't as wide. But my point is you're one or the other, right? And he's definitely a Fender guy because of his obsession with the 64 Strat that he sees in there. So completely agree with you when you said like, I think there's a pretty big significant missed opportunity at the beginning. I went, yeah, it's Fender. Because it would have been a natural fit. It would have been an easy sell. He lives the brand. People watching his program, Wayne could talk about that brand without sacrificing any of his values as an individual or like a hard rocker. All of it made sense. That would have been the perfect brand to incorporate into Wayne's World. So Fender presents Wayne World, or more appropriately, Wayne's World presented by Fender, is how, if I were the one that was selling it, that's how I would structure it. That's who I would go to. And honestly, I don't know that if they didn't see it, I would keep going until they saw the value in it. And then I would go take episodes of Wayne's World to Fender and show it to them and say, you are the only brand that makes sense for this program, right? Yeah. And we're talking about a self-produced show that cost them $0 to make out of his mom's basement. We'll increase the production value so that, it's representative of what Fender wants in a brand.
Yeah.
And that you're adding value to the experience, and they'll be grateful for that and like happy to plug you on the show. But we're talking about a few $100s an episode, even now, even in 2024, to do something like that. If they paid $250, $500 to produce an episode per week, which is nothing for a major brand like that to support some like local content, I think even now, if there were a thing like Wayne's World, for those of you that are on ACTV 10 now in Aurora, Illinois, give this some thought. I think it's marketable now to a brand if it really fits who you're doing. That's good value because these local audiences are where the rubber meets the road for brand. These are the people you're trying to connect with where you don't have that sort of community engagement. I mean, we heard, John Kander and Dan Coates talk about this when we did White Men Can't Jump. That's how you put a face to the brands with local communities because these are the people that engage with you, right? And so for people that live in Aurora that love this show, Fender would get a ton of value, not just there in that particular market, which Wayne calls it a suburb of Chicago. I wouldn't consider it a suburb of Chicago. I mean, it's 2 hours outside of Chicago almost, but Chicagoland would take notice that Fender was sponsoring the show, and it would start getting recognition, and they'd have like an online web presence where you could go and watch last night's episode, on local Aurora television. It would have a broader audience than it did at 92. Now
it would be so much bigger today.
And the social components to it, and they do this for their podcasts now too. Very, very influential and accessible for brands to engage with the content that's being produced every night, and then they can take ownership and snippets of it and be able to produce it. And I mean, we do this stuff with the show that we're producing, but there's a lot of value in a brand in supporting local community television. And honestly, going into this, I didn't know if that was going to be the result, but the more we're talking about it, I'm thinking, yes, absolutely. Somebody make Wayne's World now for real. Go get Fender to sponsor it, and this is going to be the most popular thing in Chicagoland. Like, no kidding. So, great takeaway. Let's just do key takeaways really quickly. We touched on a lot of these. I can sort of like regroup mine. I know I made a joke about, what would Noah Vanderhoff do, and hopefully we can bring that back for future episodes. But I mean, basically, watch out for salesmanship. Make sure you're asking the right questions before you enter into a sponsor agreement, so you don't end up in a situation where you feel like you sacrificed your entire creative vision for the purpose of getting paid to do it, and then integrate sponsors in the wrong way, because that doesn't add any value to your sponsors either, right? Like Noah's Arcade didn't get anything. In fact, when they fired Wayne and then he stole all the equipment, there's probably a lawsuit that resulted in that where he's trying to
God, that SWAT would have shown up at his house. I mean,
all sorts of breach of contract. Settlements coming out of that. So anyway, that would have been a complete legal nightmare if you just went and stole stuff out of Oliver Communications and their producer, took it out to Aurora, and then broadcasted yourself with equipment they paid for. That would have been a brutal legal battle. But anyway,
a nightmare. Yeah.
And they probably would have netted out where everybody lost money, because it's not like Wayne Campbell makes the joke earlier on that is currently unemployed and he wants to get paid to do Wayne's World. So if he's not getting paid to do Wayne's World, he doesn't have any income. I don't know exactly what Oliver Communications would go after. I don't know what that contract looks like, what that verbiage should be, but yeah. So make sure you know what you're signing before you sign it. Look out for, some of those like high pressure sales tactics. Don't sign anything you're not comfortable with. It's okay to take your time. And that goes for anything. Employment contracts on up, like take your time, review it. Make sure you know what you're signing.
And if you have a Garth moment, stop and have a Garth moment and think about it.
Exactly. Trust Garth's instincts, right? Another thing we didn't really talk about, but between the two of them, because they make that bad deal, and Garth has reservations about it, but Wayne wants to go and profit from his show, and sort of pulling along Garth with him. Garth even calls him out on it, like, you're dragging me along with you, and I didn't want to do this, and that breaks up their partnership. If you don't do things correctly, it doesn't just impact your art; it impacts the partners you're doing it with too. So make sure that you're doing things in an authentic way, and that you're engaging with the right brands, and that's where you can still, even now, for something like this type of property, get a significant amount of value out of it, not only from the brand side, but it's going to help you produce something even on a lower level in those local community audiences. And perhaps this is like a hidden plug for podcasts. Independent media is certainly on the rise, and it offers a lot of value to partners. And if you listen to podcasts, you've heard sponsored plugs throughout those. That's because audiences are valuable, especially if a brand is tying into something that you care passionately about. And in this case, people were, fervent followers of Wayne's World in the context of the movie. Yeah. And that's true for those local cable shows now. So yeah, go check out Aurora Cable 10. They've got some good programming on there. If you're a brand, there might be something you can tie into. Check out their podcast. I have no problem plugging them. I think what they're doing out there is great. I think those are all my takeaways. What'd you have, DJ? Anything we haven't talked about?
You know what? I have such higher level of appreciation for the humor in that movie, like the satirical humor in that movie, than I would have 30 years ago when it came out, and growing up how I grew up in that era, and then seeing that kind of reflected in this movie from around that time, it was just, it's kind of, honestly, it's kind of a stupid movie, just how goofy it is, but like the content of it is so relevant even today. And there's so much to learn from it. And like watching it a few times then, and getting some of these things, and then doing all the research that I did into some of these topics, like was just, it was another eye opener. Every one of these episodes that we do is an eye opener for me, but this one was particularly eye opening because it involves something that I'm familiar with, obviously, the music world and the video world and everything like that. And my biggest thing out of that was the knowing your audience thing.
For sure.
If there would have been one difference in any of the circumstances of that sponsorship, Noah's Arcade presents Wayne's World.
Right.
As it sat, none of it made any sense. And I kept going back to that time and time and time again. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And like every part of it didn't make sense. If one thing had changed, if Noah's Arcade had been Noah's, I don't know, bowling alley, or Noah's something else, not an arcade,
right,
it would have made more sense.
So using your example, Fender approaches Wayne and says, look, like you had mentioned earlier, Fender isn't synonymous with shredding, right? We're not necessarily a head metal guitar. Everybody that follows your show are these metalheads that think you're, goofy, juvenile, whatever. Humor is attracted to them. They stay and watch your, the entirety of your 15 minutes, and you play a guitar at the start that isn't one of ours. We want to be associated with that metal culture because we don't agree with artists' opinion that we can't shred. And we want to use your show to show people that we can, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that could have been a valid.
Like, and he says, I'm a Fender man myself. I completely agree with you. Let's show our audience who it is. And Fender engages with that show. There wouldn't be a movie, right? Because that would have just worked. And nobody wants to watch an hour and a half film about a partnership that makes sense in 1992 if the underlying context is like Gen X anxiety about, selling out. That would have been the antithesis of selling out. It would have been a relevant brand that enhanced what Wayne was trying to do. And then he would have had his goal of he's getting paid to do what he loves. And he also gets to stay true to his values. And ultimately, if you're developing a sponsorship program, like you said, that one thing changes, right? You get the right partner, totally different experience. There's no movie, right? We wouldn't be sitting here talking about this for an hour and a half. So it's a perfect note to end on for this discussion, because it's not a fit. I think we've identified why. So what's next for KSD Studios?
You know, we're reaching out on, you know, like our social media platforms on LinkedIn and Facebook and stuff like that for anybody who's looking for remote production at a reasonable, like affordable price. I mean, something that, you know, you get a quality finished product out of. And that's what we're all about. I mean, we're all about, you know, the client happiness and that finished product as an artist, whether you're a podcast artist or you're a guitarist or you're whatever. You know,
we're going to make them sound good, right?
That's the whole point. That's what we care about, and that's what we're out to do. So, you know, anybody who wants that and that level of commitment, come on my way. Check out www.ksdstudios.com. Drop me a line.
There you go. Well, DJ, I know I'm going to see you on the next one we do, because, you know, you're integral to the production of this show, but I appreciate you coming on, talking a little bit about your background. I think with regard to the content, you know, and I'm sure people listening to this know that we try and sync up whatever film we're doing or experience, you know, with the experience of the individual. Your background on this one, you know, when I first had this idea, I was like, we should do this, you know, together, knowing your background, and it's going to be entertaining for people to listen to, because this is the world that you come from around this time frame.
Yeah.
You know, not necessarily the same age as the characters in the movie, but like we both grew up around the same time with this type of content. And again, we couldn't have found a more perfect synergy between guest and content than this movie. And it was kind of a hunch more so than what we actually had as like a finished product. So I'm thrilled to have you on here and that we had this conversation. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for being on and doing this one with me.
Yeah,
I think the audience is going to get a lot out of it.
It was great. And, we went down so many roads I was not expecting us to go down, but you know, that's the nature of the fun of this kind of thing. So yeah.
Party on.
Party on.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of False Market Value. This episode is produced by DJ Cruiser from KSD Studios in Fort Mill, South Carolina. I'm your host, Ross Kennerly, founder of Quant Sponsorship Consulting in Las Vegas. We've got a special treat for you this week. In lieu of our usual theme music, we're going to have DJ play us out. This is from Big Old Time Medley, a song from the album Reduced to Chaos by the band Vitalis, played by DJ Cruiser. Check them out on YouTube. Take it away, DJ, and we'll see you next time.